Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about the Nuclear Threat Initiative Index 2020. The NTI Nuclear Security Index is the first of its kind public benchmarking project of nuclear security conditions on a country-by-country basis in 176 countries. Initially launched in 2012, the NTI Index has sparked international discussions about priorities required to strengthen security and, most important, is encouraging governments to provide assurances and take actions to reduce risks. The NTI Index 2020 says Pakistan is the most improved country after increasing its overall score by 7 points. On the whole, Pakistan ranked 19 with 47 points, while India ranked one place below at 20th spot with 41 points. The majority of improvements for Pakistan were in the security and control measures category, which increased by 25 points because of the passage of new regulations. Improvement was also witnessed in the global norms category, in which the ranking improved by 1 point. The report says that Pakistan's newest regulations mark a much larger shift compared with other countries' score improvements in the security and control measures category. Pakistan's increase of 25 points is the second largest improvement of any country since the index first launched in 2012. To discuss the significance of NTI Index and improved score compared to India, we have with us Dr. Naeem Salek, a former brigadier of Pakistan Army who served as Director, Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at the Strategic Plans Division, Professor Michael Clarke, former Director General at Royal United Services Institute and visiting professor at King's College London, and Dr. Rifat Hussain, Head of Department of Public Policy at NUST. Thank you to all the panelists. Let me begin with Professor Clarke here. Professor Clarke, what is the significance of this NTI index?
Well, the index is an independent assessment in conjunction with the Economist Intelligence Unit. So it's very respectable. It does good research work. Its analysis is very well respected across the world. And it looks on an annual basis, more or less, at the security of nuclear stocks, as you said, across 176 different countries. It concentrates mainly, of course, on the 9 nuclear weapon states and those countries that have nuclear weapon stocks, nuclear stocks of some sort. But its conclusions are always taken seriously. And I have to say that the idea that Pakistan is the most improved country in the index is something to take some pride in, and congratulations to Pakistan on that. Having said that, also, the index records that we shouldn't be complacent, and that the situation across the world is not as good as it was 5 years ago. So Pakistan is doing better in a situation that is slipping into worse territory than in 2015, 2016.
Absolutely. I'm happy you pointed that out, because the report says that the improvements are not taking place not because there is no room for improvement. In fact, they talk about lots of gaps in the report. One issue that I want to draw your attention to, and which the report also seems pretty concerned about, is the cybersecurity part of it. And there have been other reports also which talk about the fact that the nuclear weapons are predate the digital world, but now we have entered the digital world. Some of them, some of the experts call it the dark territory, given the cyber insecurities and the rest of it. So give me a sense of how you look at this new challenge of cybersecurity with reference to nuclear weapons and nuclear-related materials.
Is a very big one. And I have to say, sitting here in the United Kingdom, it really worries the British government from the point of view of our own nuclear weapons. Even though we and the Americans and the Australians score very high on this agenda, on this index, the cyber issues really bother us as well, because cyber insecurity is not fully understood. And although nuclear weapon stocks and nuclear systems are very carefully controlled and monitored, the problem is that cyber can get in through the support services. So all nuclear establishments, they need catering, they need lighting, they need electricians, they need plumbing. It's very hard to insulate an environment, an installation, from all outside work. And so it is possible, because everybody uses the internet now, everybody uses cyber as a way of doing business, the worry is that actors, particularly terrorist groups, can get inside these installations, not by attacking the installation itself, but by getting in through the caterers or the plumbers or the electricians. I mean, the United States had one of its defense establishments cyber attacked a few years ago via the street lighting outside, because the street lighting was computerized as to when it came on and when it went off around the year. So it's very difficult to protect any site from a really determined cyber attack. And that's a new form of, if you like, cyber arms race, which is taking place in nuclear facilities across the world. And I have to say, we worry about it in Europe and the United States. The general view is that cybersecurity is terrible in most other parts of the world. That's the general belief.
Absolutely. It's a very long discussion. But the one final question, Professor Clark. The report also talks about cooperation. In fact, it talks about this current pathogen, the coronavirus, and the fact that, these challenges can emerge and states have to cooperate. The problem with reference to nuclear-related materials and nuclear weapons is that cooperation in many cases is not possible by the very reason of security. And every state, especially the nuclear weapon states, are very secretive about their arsenals and the rest of it. What kind of cooperation can be ensured apart from, shall I say, exchanging best practices?
Well, you're absolutely right. The COVID-19 crisis makes interaction between officials even more difficult than it was before. And so it slows down the way in which countries can cooperate with each other to tighten up on their security or do something about it. So the COVID crisis creates gaps for criminals or terrorists to be able to move into and to actually pursue their own ends. The most important thing, I think, in the nuclear business is that all countries with nuclear facilities, I mean, we're talking here about 9 nuclear weapon states, of course, of which Pakistan is one, and about 15 or 20 other states with significant nuclear facilities one way or another. So we're talking about a group of 29 or 30 states that need to prioritize the security of all of their nuclear and radiological systems. And the best way to do that across the world, of course, is to increase the authority, if wherever possible, of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, because the IAEA has a good reputation. It needs more resources and it needs more political clout in order to standardize security across the world. But even in spite of COVID, it can do that if countries are prepared to sign up to IAEA regulations or norms. Even if they're not members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as Pakistan is not, they could still observe IAEA guidelines in those respects.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Michael Clark, speaking with us. Let me go straight to Dr. Salik here. Dr. Salik, a matter of pride personally for you also, as being one of the central figures in at the time that the National Command Authority was constituted, and it's been a long journey. Give us a sense of how we have overall, how we have improved all this, because I remember there were so many concerns about Pakistan, and nobody really talked about India. And now we see that India is sort of slot below Pakistan in terms of improvements in overall security and safety. So walk us through this journey, because you were part of this.
Actually, Jaz, Pakistan had done a lot of things in terms of improving the safety and security of its nuclear materials, installations, and weapons, particularly after the 9/11. I think Pakistan is one country which has invested the most in terms of financial resources as well as the manpower in improving its security. I remember we started off with a brigadier as advisor security NCA with a few dozen people, mostly retired military personnel, taking care of the security at nuclear installations. And then within a few years, it has expanded into a force comprising 30,000 people with two-star generals now a part of it. The Pakistan Center of Excellence on Nuclear Security has been appreciated and acknowledged by the IAEA, and it has been running courses sponsored by the IAEA for regional countries on radiation and nuclear security. And it has been acknowledged as one of the best and world-class institutions of its kind. So these things were there, but unfortunately, the media and parts of think tanks in the Western world were still painting Pakistan in a very negative light. Even in the US administration, one official would make a negative statement, the other would try to pacify that. So that had been going on, but I think we should be thankful to NTI because they have done a great service, because it's a very credible setup, and their reports are taken very seriously. So since they have instituted this Nuclear Security Index in 2012, even in the very first index, Pakistan was placed in a much better position. So at least whatever Pakistan had done, it has been put on record and it has been acknowledged through these. This is the fifth version of this security index. So we have to be, I think, very happy and reassured on this. But obviously, as has been mentioned earlier, also that there is no room for complacency. It's nuclear security, as they say, is not a destination; it's a journey. It's a continuous process. You have to continue to evaluate your systems in relation to the new and emerging threats. Mention has been made of cyber threat. I think it's very difficult, as Professor Clark had pointed out, for any country to make itself immune from cyber threat. So there is a need, because of the sensitivity of the issue, of an international conference and international treaty on at least putting some ban on cyber attacks on nuclear installations, because they can cause very serious accidents. As we have seen recently at Natanz in Iran, some reports suggest that this was a cyber attack which actually caused fire at that facility. So if it damages the control systems of a nuclear facility, it can be very, very dangerous, not only for that country, but for the neighborhood also. So I think something needs to be done to have some kind of guidelines, a code of conduct in terms of separating the cyber activities from the critical nuclear facilities. That is one. The other is, as has been mentioned by the NTA report itself, the nuclear security summits of the Obama era had given a boost to the nuclear security, and the awareness was greatly increased, especially at the political level, highest political level in most countries. And that showed the results in those years. But since the end of that process, the interest has waned. Although IAEA had been trying to keep it up, but it has not come up to that level. However, there is still that possibility. IAEA holds ministerial level meetings every year, and if they continue that and put some more energy behind it, I think the upward curve in development of nuclear security and safety around the world will continue.
Thank you. A very important point. I will get back to you, Dr. Saleh, with a couple of more questions, but let me pull in Dr. Rifat Hussain here. Dr. Hussain, as someone who's taught, conceptualized, advised on these issues, I'm sure you'd also be very happy at the fact that the NTI has acknowledged Pakistan's efforts that were not being acknowledged, not because Pakistan had not made the efforts, but because for certain interest groups and states, it was politically infeasible to acknowledge that. So give me your reading of this report.
Well, thank you, Jaz. I think Pakistan should feel gratified and Pakistan should feel happy for the upgradation in its ranking, particularly as compared to India. We are getting a much better score on all the matrices or all the indicators on which this report is based. It's a very complex assessment, and I think while we acknowledge this, I would still say that on the in the high risk category, the NTI need to look at the complex security environment in which Pakistan lives, and because the environment that we are living in is marked by a lot of conflict with India, which is our nuclear neighbor. Even though we have extensive cooperation with China, but in the absence of a dialogue with India, particularly on the nuclear issues, and the overall suspension of India-Pakistan dialogue uh, uh, creates great worries, and particularly when the Indians are trying to tap into the cyber collaboration with not only with Israel but also with the United States itself. So that should be a cause for concern. But I think overall Pakistan should feel very happy the way Pakistan's nuclear infrastructure and particularly the security of the physical and the physical security of the fissile material has been ensured, and Pakistan has introduced several legislative measures through which it has sent out a message of reassurance to the international community, and I'm glad that that message has finally been received.
So, a couple of points are important with reference to what you're saying, Dr. Hussain. One, these issues cannot be divorced from the broader strategic context. And that broader strategic context, unfortunately, has to do with an intransigent, irredentist government in India. And that is something that we need to discuss with our international partners. And secondly, as Dr. Salek also mentioned, these cyber attacks, unfortunately, this is a new way of warfare begun by the United States. Israel, they did this against Iran. There are other incidents also. So perhaps, as Dr. Salek mentioned, and I will take this to Dr. Salek also, that just like other agreements of non-attack agreements with reference to nuclear facilities, that there could also be some move. Pakistan could perhaps initiate that to have agreements against non-cyber attacks with reference to nuclear facilities.
Absolutely right, Ijaz. But the basic problem that I see with the cyber attacks or efforts to contain those cyber attacks or the cyber attacks incidents is the plausible deniability, because you do not know, even though there's a lot of research that has been done in the initial attack that occurred in Iran, the Stuntness attack, but we know who was behind it, but still there is no public acknowledgement of this attack. So cyber attacks can be carried out by non-state actors, or they can be carried out by technologically advanced countries against a weaker or against a particular target country, and that has become the preferred mode of encouraging what is known as the counter-proliferation. So I am very concerned about this, because as more and more technological collaboration takes place, and the conversation of which Pakistan is not a part. So Pakistan should be, there's only so much that Pakistan can do to regulate its the cyberspace, which is part of Pakistan's territory. But outside Pakistan territory, there's little that is within Pakistan's control. So this is one area in which Pakistan needs to initiate. And I absolutely agree with your proposal that in the future initiatives, one could be one measure that Pakistan could initiate would be the non-attack on the communication and command and control systems in Pakistan, because there are a lot of countries who are thinking of launching decapitating attacks against the command and control nuclear centers. And once you knock off the command and control, this is the old model which went back to 1991 and 93 Second Gulf War, whereby you knock out the command and control system, and you are basically blinding the target country
Absolutely.
of all possibilities of a counter response. So that's an area that I'm very concerned about it. And
that's also very stabilizing as far as deterrence is concerned. But let me take this to Dr. Salik here. Dr. Salik, some of the issues that Dr. Hussain just talked about, I want to get your take on that. But before I wrap up, I also want you to give us a sense of the vulnerabilities that India has in terms of safety and security of these materials.
See, first of all, the biggest problem in India's case is that they still do not have an autonomous nuclear regulatory authority, which in fact is an international obligation for being members of the Nuclear Security Convention. But their regulatory authority is still under the nuclear operator itself, the Indian Atomic Energy Commission. And that is the biggest flaw, because unless you have an autonomous regulatory authority like the Pakistan Nuclear Regulatory Authority, you cannot ensure the safety and security, and there is a tendency to cover up mistakes and gaps and flaws in the system. The second is the kind of security system they have. The Indians have what they call the Central Industrial Security Force. Now that force reminds me of something we used to have, the Ministry of Defense Constabulary kind of a thing. Yeah. It's a second-grade force which is used for protection of all industries in India, anywhere. And this is a kind of a paramilitary, in fact, not a very well-trained and very capable force. Compared with the security force, we have 30,000 people who have been specially recruited, specially trained at the SPD Academy, and they have a mock nuclear facility also there, so they are capable of handling nuclear and radiation emergencies. They have not only the well-trained ground forces which defend the fixed installations, they have an air element with both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, and this rapid reaction force can be airlifted to any part of the country within half an hour. Similarly, they have a marine element, and then they have counterintelligence team. So it's a very comprehensive system. Compared with that, if you look at India, they just have, as I said, the Central Industrial Security Force. So there's virtually no comparison. There's a lot of difference. I think they have been lucky that there hasn't been a major lapse of security, but we keep hearing about some kind of problems here and there. So they need to look at it. And particularly once we were talking about the cyber security, if we remember last year, there was an attack which at that time it was reported that might have been initiated from North Korea, which attacked one of the Indian nuclear facilities. So they are not even well protected against cyber attacks. So these are serious issues, and because of the widespread dangers which can be posed by an accident at nuclear facility, it's in the interest of not that particular country, but the whole region. So therefore, cooperation at regional level is very important. And
Absolutely.
Even if there is not an international treaty, whenever India-Pakistan resume talks, I think it should be on the top of the agenda that, like non-attack on each other's nuclear facilities, there should be an agreement on non-attack, non-cyber attack on each other's nuclear facilities and command and control structures.
I'm happy that both of you agree with my suggestion that we should actually make this proposal. And I agree with Dr. Hussain that it's very difficult to figure out. There is the element of plausible deniability, but you can actually trace it also. So this is one of those issues, but I think we all must congratulate ourselves, frankly, for having done this performance, which has been also listed by NTI Index. Thank you so much to Brigadier Dr. Naeem Salek. Thank you to Dr. Rifat Hussain. We shall take a short break and return to discuss India's illegal move to embark on a delimitation exercise in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about India embarking on an exercise to delimit constituencies in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir. It is important to remember that on 5th August 2019, India illegally annexed occupied Kashmir, stripping it of its special status and downgrading it to the status of Union territory. All of this was done illegally and without the consent of Kashmiris. Subsequently, the illegal administration in Jammu and Kashmir have passed laws that seek to grab Kashmiri land and settle outsiders in Kashmir. To discuss the delimitation exercise in the backdrop of India's illegal moves, we are joined by Saib Beg, an eminent Kashmiri lawyer currently studying at the University of Oxford. We also have with us Zafar Qureshi, who is a Kashmiri and resides in London. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Mr. Beg here. Mr. Beg, just give me one specific, reality, shall I say, in terms of whether this delimitation of Kashmir is permissible under Indian law, and if it is not, is this violates international law?
Yes, indeed. Thank you for the question and thank you for having me. So first of all, you see, this action violates Indian law as well as international law. In India, the delimitation exercise has been frozen since 2002 until 2026 by a constitutional amendment. But it has also been frozen specifically for Kashmir. You see, under the Farooq Abdullah government in 2002, they froze delimitation till 2026 by a constitutional amendment of the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. So the action of the Indian government is disregarding both of these amendments as well as decisions of the Supreme Court of India. So this action of delimitation, it just represents the political immorality that is pervasive in India by creating the appearance of a legal mandate to govern and legitimize their actions in a place where no such mandate exists. So in one nutshell, if I can tell you, yes, it violates national law as well as international law under the UDHR, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, under Article 23. It violates that as well. So this action does not stand the test of law. You see, the Article 21 of the UDHR states that the will of the people shall be the basis of authority of a government. And this will is expressed by equivalent free voting procedures. What the government of India is doing is going to create differential status for votes in Kashmir in comparison with votes from Jammu. So it is not an equivalent structure, and therefore it is also violative of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So to answer your question, it violates both the principles of law under Indian law as well as under international law.
Would it be any use if this is challenged in the Indian Supreme Court? I ask this. The reason I say would it be any use is because, unfortunately, what we have seen of the Indian Supreme Court's approach over the last 2 years or so does not evoke much confidence in that apex body.
That's a very pertinent question because, unfortunately, the way the law is designed around this is a highly contentious action because it cannot even be challenged before a court. Under Article 329 of India's Constitution, it is stipulated that the decision of the Delimitation Commission is final. It cannot even be challenged before the Supreme Court of India. Therefore, when delimitation takes place, it can only happen with the utmost confidence of the people where this exercise is taking place. But in the case of Kashmir, the action of the Indian government does not inspire any confidence. And you need to understand that this is happening in the backdrop of disenfranchisement of Muslims in India for decades. See, Muslims are underrepresented in Indian politics. The Sachar Committee report of 2006, it had noted that areas of Muslim concentration in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar, in West Bengal, they had been declared as reserved constituencies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, thereby denying Muslims political representation. In Kashmir also, the government is planning to declare some constituencies reserved for ST and SC candidates, thereby further reducing Muslim representation. So what I'm trying to say is that the act has grave ramifications because it cannot be challenged before a court also. So let alone the facade of justice, because as Kashmiris, we have seen how new parameters are engineered by the court. These parameters don't even exist in law. So in the case of Kashmir, these parameters are engineered. But even that facade of justice cannot be accessed in this case by the way, in the manner in which the law is structured. We cannot challenge it before any court. And it needs to be understood that delimitation exercises have been taking place even in Kashmir and in India for many decades now. There have been 4 delimitation exercises in India till now, one in 1952 and 10 years after that in 1963, then 10 years after that in 1973. But since 1973 till 2002, the action of delimitation was frozen in India because some states in India had a lot of population growth, states where family planning measures were not implemented. So they were being overrepresented in politics, whereas states such as Punjab and most states of South India, which did not engage in family planning measures, were underrepresented. So this action of delimitation was frozen till 2002. And again, in 2002, the Constitution of India was specifically amended to freeze delimitation across all states in India until 2026. What this means is that even under Indian law, delimitation is frozen for all states of India. And under Kashmiri law, it was specifically frozen by an amendment in 2002. Now, there is an argument that Jammu is unfairly represented. If you give me some time to address that, it's a very important point to address.
That's a very important point, and we'll certainly come to that. But I just want to go back as a layperson. You're the lawyer, you're the legal mind. While post facto, the decisions of the Delimitation Commission cannot be challenged, when I said if this matter could be referred to the Supreme Court, and although I've voiced my skepticism about what the Supreme Court can do, I was basing it in the fact that on the basis of the exercise being unconstitutional to begin with.
Yes, you see, the 2019 State Reorganization Act, which is empowering this delimitation to take place, that is the act under which Jammu and Kashmir was bifurcated, it was made into a union territory. That act is already under challenge in the Supreme Court of India. So what the government of India is doing is using the 2019 Act to change the delimitation, the constituencies in Kashmir, and that act is already under challenge. So, but the action which will take place through the Delimitation Commission cannot be challenged. So the primary, the parent.
So why can't in Supreme Court say that until this is sub judice, that it prevents the Indian government from taking any further actions that emanate from the Reorganization Act?
You see, this is a question as lawyers we've been asking before the Supreme Court of India for quite this last 1 year. Until now, even a bench has not been constituted to hear the matters under Article 370. So the Supreme Court is going to move at a very slow pace, and we had expected, at least equitable justice would expect or demand that a stay order should be imposed on any purchase of land in Kashmir by non-Kashmiris, any change in domicile, any change in demography, any change in delimitation. A stay order must be imposed because once these changes are effected, they cannot be reversed.
Correct. Let's get to that Jammu that you're trying to make.
You see, first of all, under the existing structure, pre-bifurcation in Jammu and Kashmir, there has been no discrimination against Jammu. It is a very widely made argument by the BJP and Indian nationalists that Jammu was being discriminated against because Kashmir had 46 seats, Jammu had 37 seats, and Ladakh had 4 seats. Now, prima facie, when you look at these numbers, it may seem that Kashmir has more seats, therefore Jammu is being discriminated against. But there are 149,000 voters per constituency in Kashmir compared with 145,000 voters per constituency in Jammu, which indicates a fair distribution. Before bifurcation of our state, the Kashmir Valley was 54% of Kashmir's total population, 15% of our total area, and it was represented by 53% of the seats. which means that 54% of the population was represented by 53% of the seats in the case of Kashmir. In the case of the Jammu division, before bifurcation, it was 25% of the total land area of Jammu and Kashmir state, 42% of the population, and it was represented by 42.5% of the seats, which means that 42% of the population in the case of Jammu had been represented by 42.5% of the seats. So clearly, this has been a very egalitarian, a fairly equitable distribution. So the argument that Jammu was unfairly represented is false. But on that note, it needs to be understood that it can be argued even Jammu itself was overrepresented, because more than half of Jammu division is Chenab Valley and Doda district, which should ideally be counted separately for area as well as population.
Correct.
But if we look just at area, there is no precedent in the world of basing delimitation on area. Some countries base delimitation on population and some countries base it on registered voters, but nowhere in the world is it based on area. In Kashmir, there are reasons why delimitation cannot be based on registered voters. First of all, many people in Kashmir Valley boycott elections. So using registered voters as a database will place the valley at a disadvantage. But it is also important to understand that in case of Jammu and Kashmir, there are discrepancies in the data itself. As per the 2002 electoral statistics, Jammu region had nearly 200,000 or 2 lakh more voters than Kashmir region. But as per data of the Election Commission of India, the Kashmir region has nearly 2.5 lakh or 250,000 more voters than Jammu region in 2014 elections. So voter registration data is unreliable, and it has always been so. In some elections, there is a higher registration in Jammu and some there is not. Now, after bifurcation of the state into 2 union territories, the Kashmir division now has 58% share of population, whereas Jammu division only has 42% of the share. But the area of Jammu division is now at 62%, whereas the area of Kashmir division is at 38%. Now, what I'm trying to say is that no matter how you cut this cake, nowhere in the world is delimitation based on area, because elections are meant to represent people and not to represent the land. But the BJP has been raising this demand for delimitation since 2008, right after the Amarnath Land Row. But the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir, as well as the Supreme Court of India in 2010, has upheld the freeze on delimitation, which was imposed by the Jammu and Kashmir government of 2002. The Supreme Court of India in 2010, they have upheld that freeze. So what the government of India is doing is that it's violating its own national law. It's disregarding decisions of the Supreme Court of India, which has already upheld the freeze imposed on delimitation. And it's also violating international law. So last point that I want to make is that there is a discussion that this move is going to help the Kashmiri Pandits. But what is being missed in this is that the Delimitation Commission is going to use census data of 2011. And there are already several groups in Jammu, including Kashmiri Pandit groups, which are opposing delimitation based on 2011 census, because they will be left out of it. The Kashmiri Pandits left after 1990s. So if you base it on the 2011 census, it is wrong for everyone. Even Kashmiri Pandits will not benefit from this.
Right. Thank you so much, Mirza Sahib Beg. As always, a pleasure listening to your very nuanced points. Let me go to Zafar Qureshi here. Mr. Qureshi, this is, of course, the legal constitutional terrain. And as Mr. Beg said, on all these benchmarks, what India has done is illegal. Now, let's get to the political side of it. Give me your reading of how you look at this exercise and what can possibly be done to throw a spanner in the works.
Thank you, Ajaz Saab. Sahib Mirza Sahib quite eloquently explained the legalities of this move. Politically, as you know, it is aimed to change the demography of the Kashmir. It is nothing new that's happening. Right from the beginning, the BJP government has trying to focus to change the demography in such a way that it shows the majority as a Hindu or a non-Muslim. And we need to be really careful. Dividing or delimiting Kashmir on the basis of land is going to be challenging and irreversible. This not only constitutes against the Indian Constitution, but against the international laws. When we look at the United Nations resolutions of 122, which completely prohibits any change to the Kashmir issue, to the Kashmir demography, to the land or the geography, this is an issue that needs to be highlighted on the international level to ensure that the Kashmir's original state is preserved until the right of self-determination.
Absolutely, pending final settlement according to the UN Security Council resolutions. But here's the thing. Those resolutions, as well as the bilateral arrangements, have already been violated by India blatantly in disregard of everything on 5th August 2019. So the sense in Delhi would be that, you know, we've pushed it through, and we let the chips fall where they might.
Absolutely, and that's what they're trying to do. But I think at this point, it is the international community that really needs to act hard and say, right, what India is doing is illegal on the international level as well as their own constitution. And this is where we need to press the international community to use all its available platforms, whether that is trade, whether that is international law, to enforce the United Nations resolutions and ensure the people of Kashmir have been given the right of self-determination. There are no changes been made to the Kashmir demography or the geography of the Kashmir. So yes, unfortunately, you know, they are counting on let's wait and see where the chips fall. But we need to work hard to make sure that does not happen, because once it has happened, it is irreversible. The likelihood of having a true, transparent right of self-determination by the people of Kashmir is going to be very, very difficult, because what we're seeing is the demographic change where the non-Kashmiris are being settled. They will be given the right to vote, and this is something that will not be acceptable to the people of Kashmir.
Aptly. Thank you so much. That was Zafar Qureshi speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.